Story 1. Story 1, The Whispers of Blackwood Pines. The crackling fire in the hearth usually soothed me, but tonight, it felt inadequate against the encroaching darkness. Blackwood Pines wasn't known for its hospitality, but my grandmother's dilapidated cabin was the only refuge I had after the city chewed me up and spat me out. The old woman was gone now, leaving me this isolated sanctuary and a lifetime of whispered warnings about the woods. "Never go out after dark, child," she'd say, her eyes wide and fearful. "Things stir in the night." I'd scoff then, but now. A shiver snaked down my spine, a prickling sensation unrelated to the chill autumn air seeping through the warped window frames. I blamed it on the wind rattling the loose shutters, the rhythmic creaking that sounded eerily like footsteps on the porch. "Just the wind," I muttered, pulling the threadbare blanket tighter around my shoulders. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a spray of sparks into the room, momentarily illuminating the dusty, cobweb-draped corners. I swear I saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of something large and unnatural. My heart hammered against my ribs. "It's nothing," I told myself again, but the words felt hollow even to my own ears. The first few nights were uneventful. Just the wind, the rustle of leaves, the hooting of an owl. Familiar sounds of the wilderness that I slowly grew accustomed to. Then, the whispers started. Faint at first, just a murmuring at the edge of hearing, like the rustling of silk in a silent room. I dismissed them as the wind playing tricks on my ears, a symptom of my growing isolation. But they grew stronger, more insistent, a chorus of unintelligible voices that seemed to surround the cabin, pressing in on me. One evening, as I sat by the fire reading a book my grandmother had left behind, a thick tome filled with folklore and local legends, I heard a distinct tapping at the window. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I lifted my head, my eyes drawn to the grimy glass. Nothing. Just the reflection of the firelight dancing on the pane. I let out a shaky breath and returned to my book, but the tapping persisted, growing more urgent, more rhythmic. I forced myself to look again. This time, I saw it. A pale, gaunt face pressed against the glass, its eyes black and empty, reflecting the flickering flames. A skeletal hand, its fingers long and gnarled, rapped against the window. I screamed, a primal sound torn from the depths of my terror, and scrambled back from the window, knocking over the chair behind me. The tapping stopped. Silence descended on the cabin, heavy and suffocating. I huddled in the corner, trembling, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for the glass to shatter, for the creature to break through. But it didn't. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. The whispers grew louder, the tapping more frequent. I boarded up the windows, barricaded the door, but it felt futile, like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. I saw the face again, flitting through the trees, its empty eyes fixed on me, watching me. I began to see other things too, shadowy figures lurking in the periphery of my vision, grotesque shapes moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't tell if they were real or just figments of my increasingly frayed mind. I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the house, every rustle in the woods, every whisper on the wind, sent jolts of adrenaline through me. My nerves were raw, my senses heightened, my mind on the verge of collapse. I knew I had to leave, to escape Blackwood Pines before whatever lurked in the shadows claimed me, but I was paralyzed by fear, trapped in a cycle of terror and anticipation. Then, one night, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than any sound I had heard. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Then, a slow, deliberate scratching began at the door. It sounded like something large, something with claws. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. The wood began to splinter. I knew I couldn't stay. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the poker from beside the fireplace, my only weapon against the unknown horror that awaited me. The door burst open, and I was plunged into darkness. I screamed, swinging the poker wildly, a blind, desperate act of self-preservation. I felt it connect with something solid, something that let out a guttural roar that echoed through the night. Then, silence again. I fumbled for the matches, my hand shaking so violently I could barely strike one. Finally, a flickering flame illuminated the cabin. The door hung open, splintered and broken. There was nothing there. But the whispers started again, closer this time, right behind me, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I turned slowly, the poker clutched tightly in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. And saw nothing. The whispers faded, replaced by the rhythmic creaking of the porch swing, swaying gently in the night breeze. The swing was empty. The woods around the cabin stand silent now, waiting. The whispers are gone, for now. But I know they're still out there, in the darkness, waiting for me to return. They are waiting for us all. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I can still hear the creaking of the empty swing. Story 2. Story 2, The Whispering Pines. The crackling fire in the hearth painted flickering shadows on the log walls of my grandfather's cabin. Pine scent hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort. Rain lashed against the windows, a constant drumming rhythm against the backdrop of the howling wind. It was a perfect night for ghost stories, and Grandpa Joe, his face etched with a lifetime of stories lived, was in his element. This happened right here, he started, his voice low, in these very woods. Back when I was a boy, younger than you, Liam. He gestured towards me, a mischievous glint in his eye. I was 14, and though I pretended to be too cool for ghost stories, the creeping unease I felt was a thrill I secretly relished. His story, a local legend about a creature that stalked the whispering pines after dark, was unnerving enough. But it was the sudden, sharp crack from outside that made my blood run cold. We both froze, the firelight dancing in our wide eyes. Probably just a branch, Grandpa Joe mumbled, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. We listened intently. The wind howled, the rain pounded, but the cracking sound didn't repeat. Unease settled in the pit of my stomach. It felt wrong. The familiar comfort of the cabin, of Grandpa Joe's presence, began to erode. Later, after Grandpa Joe had retired to his room, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind had died down, and the rain had softened to a gentle patter. But the silence felt heavier, more pregnant with unseen things. I kept thinking about the cracking sound, about Grandpa Joe's story. Then, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It came from the woods, just beyond the cabin walls. My heart hammered against my ribs. I told myself it was just an animal, a bear maybe, but the sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It came again, closer this time. Followed by another sound, a slithering, dragging sound. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I pulled the covers up to my chin, squeezing my eyes shut. It felt childish, but it was the only thing I could do to stave off the terror that threatened to engulf me. The next morning, Grandpa Joe was unusually quiet. He kept glancing towards the woods, a worried crease etched between his brows. He brushed off my questions about the noises, attributing them to the storm. But his eyes held a flicker of something I'd never seen before, fear. We went outside to inspect the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was damp and soft from the rain, and there, imprinted in the mud, were tracks. Not the paw prints of a bear, but something else entirely. 3 long, clawed marks, arranged in a triangular pattern, unlike anything I'd ever seen. They led from the edge of the woods, stopped just short of the cabin wall, and then vanished. The rest of the day was strained. Grandpa Joe kept looking out the window, his hand resting on the old hunting rifle he kept by the door. The usual comfortable silence of the cabin was replaced by an oppressive tension, a shared unspoken fear. As night fell again, the dread returned, thicker and more palpable. The wind picked up, rustling the pines into an unsettling whisper. We sat by the fire, neither of us speaking, both listening. Listening for the growl, for the slithering, for the cracking sound that had started it all. It came just after midnight. The same guttural growl, deeper and more menacing than before. This time, it was accompanied by a heavy thud against the cabin wall, as if something large had thrown itself against it. Grandpa Joe grabbed the rifle. His hand trembled as he cocked it. We both stared at the door, our breaths held tight in our chests. Another thud, harder this time. The wooden planks of the wall groaned under the impact. Then, silence. A terrifying, suffocating silence. We waited, minutes stretching into an eternity. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind, sent a jolt of fear through me. Finally, Grandpa Joe lowered the rifle. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice hoarse. But I didn't believe him. I could feel it, a presence lurking just outside, in the whispering pines. Waiting. We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the dying embers of the fire, listening to the wind whisper secrets through the trees. At dawn, we went outside. The tracks were back, deeper this time, circling the cabin. And on the wall, near the door, we found a single, long scratch. Deep enough to have split the wood, had it been pressed just a fraction of an inch harder. We left the cabin that morning, neither of us saying a word about what we'd experienced. We haven't been back since. The whispering pines still stand, a dark silhouette against the horizon. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear it. The growl, low and guttural, a promise of something terrible waiting in the shadows. And I wonder, what would have happened if it had pushed just a little harder? What would have happened if it had gotten in? Story 3. Story 3, The Static. The hum of the refrigerator was my lullaby. A familiar, almost comforting sound in the oppressive silence of my empty apartment. I sat hunched over a lukewarm cup of tea, staring blankly at the flickering late-night news, the muted voices a dull counterpoint to the rhythmic whirring coming from the kitchen. It was late, or perhaps early, the kind of hour where the line between night and day blurred into a hazy, indistinct grey. I can't remember exactly when it started. It was subtle at first, a low, persistent hiss woven into the background noise of the city. I dismissed it as interference, a quirk of the old building. But it grew. Night after night, it intensified, a pervasive static that seemed to seep into my bones. One evening, as I was locking up for the night, I heard a scratching at my door. A slow, deliberate scrape that made the hairs on my arm stand on end. Peeking through the peephole revealed nothing but the dimly lit hallway, the flickering fluorescent light casting long, distorted shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. Silence. Then, just as I was about to pull away, the scratching returned, louder this time, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic tapping. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it. The next day, I mentioned it to Mrs. Diaz, the elderly woman who lived across the hall. She just gave me a knowing look and said, "The static brings things." I tried to laugh it off, told her it was probably just kids messing around. But her words, the unsettling calmness in her voice, stuck with me. The static grew louder, more insistent. It began to permeate everything, a constant, oppressive presence that filled my apartment, my head, my very being. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside my window, sent jolts of fear through me. I started seeing things in the periphery of my vision, fleeting shadows that darted out of sight whenever I turned to look. I tried to rationalize it, told myself it was stress, fatigue. I even bought a white noise machine, hoping to drown out the static. But it was no use. The static was more than just a sound, it was a feeling, a suffocating blanket of dread that wrapped itself around me, tightening its grip with each passing night. One particularly bad night, the static was so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. I paced my apartment, my hands clenched into fists, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air felt thick, heavy, charged with an unseen energy. I could feel eyes on me, watching me from the shadows, from the corners of the room. I turned on all the lights, but the feeling persisted. Then, the scratching returned. Louder, more frantic than before. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside the apartment. I backed into a corner, clutching a heavy glass vase, my only weapon against the unseen menace that surrounded me. The tapping accompanied the scratching, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic beat that seemed to synchronize with the pounding of my heart. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the apartment into complete darkness. The static intensified, a deafening roar that filled my ears, my head, my entire being. I screamed, a primal, desperate cry that was swallowed by the static. The scratching and tapping grew closer, closing in on me. I swung the vase wildly, shattering it against the wall, the sharp crack echoing through the darkness. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The static faded, the scratching ceased, the tapping disappeared. Silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. I stood there, frozen in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, the broken shards of the vase digging into my palms. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I waited, listening, straining my ears for any sign that the horror had returned. After what felt like an eternity, the first rays of dawn began to filter through the blinds, painting the room in a pale, ethereal light. I slowly lowered myself to the floor, my legs trembling beneath me. I looked around the apartment, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. There was nothing there. No sign of the scratching, the tapping, the static. Just the familiar objects of my everyday life, bathed in the soft light of morning. But the silence remained. A heavy, pregnant silence, filled with the unspoken promise of something more to come. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the static hadn't gone. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the night to return. And then, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss, coming from the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator. But it was different now. Deeper. More resonant. And woven into its rhythmic whirring was a subtle, persistent static. I haven't slept since. I sit here now, in the dim light of the perpetually dawning day, watching, waiting, listening. The static is growing louder. And I know, deep down, that when the night finally returns, I won't be alone. Story 4. Story 4, The Obsidian Hum. The desert night was a canvas of oppressive black, punctuated by the indifferent glitter of a billion distant suns. The air, still shimmering with the day's heat, pressed against my skin like a damp cloth. I was driving back from a conference in Phoenix, alone, taking the scenic route through the desolate backroads. My phone had died hours ago, swallowed by the emptiness like everything else out here. Radio static was my only companion. Just a few more hours, I muttered, tapping the steering wheel to the rhythm of a song I could no longer hear. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, creating a fleeting tunnel of illumination in the vast, swallowing night. Then, the hum started. Low, barely audible, it vibrated through the chassis of the car. I dismissed it as engine trouble at first, but the pitch steadily deepened, resonating not just in the car but seemingly within my bones. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic. Ancient. The static on the radio intensified into a roar, and the headlights flickered, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the empty landscape. The hum grew stronger, pulsing with a sickening rhythm, and a strange, metallic taste filled my mouth. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. I pulled over, the silence outside amplified by the sudden absence of engine noise. Only the hum remained, now a palpable presence in the air. It resonated with the darkness, with the vast, indifferent expanse of the desert, weaving a tapestry of dread so thick I could almost taste it. I tried to start the car, but the engine was dead. Completely dead. No clicking, no whirring, just a heavy, unsettling silence. I fumbled for my phone, its lifeless screen mocking me. No signal. No help. Just me, alone, enveloped by the growing hum and the oppressive, watchful darkness. Then, I saw it. On the horizon, a faint, shimmering light, pulsating in time with the hum. It wasn't a normal light, it was wrong. It shifted and warped, defying any natural explanation. It was as if a tear had been ripped in the fabric of reality, revealing something other. Something vast and incomprehensible. Terror, primal and overwhelming, seized me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there, paralyzed by the sheer alienness of it. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, not by physical restraints, but by the sheer weight of cosmic dread that pressed down on me. The light grew larger, closer, and the hum intensified, becoming a physical force that vibrated against my skin. I saw shapes within the light, impossible geometries that shifted and writhed, defying Euclidean space. The air grew thick, heavy with an otherworldly scent, the blend of ozone and something metallic, like blood. Then, a voice. Not a voice I heard with my ears, but a voice that echoed within my mind, a voice that wasn't made of sound but of pure, unfiltered dread. It spoke not in words, but in emotions, in concepts too vast and terrible for human comprehension. It spoke of things that existed before time, of realities beyond human understanding, of entities that dwarfed galaxies in their immensity. I understood then. This wasn't a random event. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was intentional. I was being observed. Studied. Chosen. The light was almost upon me, and the shapes within it coalesced into something. I couldn't describe it. Not then. Not now. It was a blasphemy against nature, a mockery of life itself. I squeezed my eyes shut, the hum now a deafening roar inside my skull, the voice a torrent of cosmic horror flooding my mind. I waited for the end. For oblivion. For the inevitable. But it didn't come. Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. The light was gone. The hum had faded to a low, distant thrum. The desert stretched before me, silent and empty, bathed in the cold, indifferent light of the stars. My car still wouldn't start. My phone was still dead. I was still alone. But something had changed. The world felt different. Thin. Fragile. As if the reality I knew was just a thin veil over something infinitely vast and terrifying. I waited for dawn, huddled in my car, every shadow a potential horror, every rustle of the wind a whispered promise of return. When the sun finally rose, painting the desert in hues of orange and gold, it brought no comfort. The fear remained, a cold knot in my stomach, a constant reminder of what I had seen, what I had heard, what I had understood. I eventually got a signal and called for help. They towed my car, and I gave a vague explanation about engine trouble. No one believed me, of course. Who would? I returned to my life, but the normalcy felt hollow. The hum is still there, faint but persistent, a constant reminder of the obsidian night and the things that lurk beyond the veil of reality. I see it sometimes, in the corner of my eye, a flicker of unnatural light, a glimpse of impossible geometries. I hear it, in the silence of the night, a whisper of cosmic dread that chills me to the bone. I know they're still watching. Waiting. And I know, with a certainty that terrifies me, that one day, the light will return. And this time, there will be no escape. Story 5. Story 5, The Stillness. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. A comforting drone in the quiet of the night. I sat at my kitchen table, the lukewarm tea growing cold in my mug. Rain lashed against the windows, a frantic percussion against the otherwise silent backdrop of 3 a.m. Work had kept me late, a frustrating tangle of deadlines and demanding clients. Now, finally home, I was too wired to sleep. Just one more chapter, I murmured to myself, picking up the worn copy of the Dunwich Horror from the table. Lovecraft's prose, normally a welcome escape, felt strangely unsettling tonight. The shadows cast by the flickering kitchen light seemed deeper, more menacing. A sudden, sharp crack from the hallway made me jump. I froze, listening. Silence. Just the rain and the hum of the refrigerator. Probably just the building settling, I muttered, though my heart hammered in my chest. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to shake the unease that was rapidly settling in. I tried to return to my book, but the word swam before my eyes. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the incessant drumming of the rain. It was then I noticed it, the refrigerator had stopped humming. The sudden absence of the familiar drone amplified the silence, making it deafening. The air felt heavy, charged. I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked towards the hallway. The shadows there seemed to writhe, stretching and contracting with each flicker of the kitchen light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The only response was the echo of my own fear. Slowly, I crept down the hallway, each step echoing unnaturally loud. The apartment felt different, alien. I reached my bedroom door, hesitant to open it. A prickling sensation ran down my spine, the feeling of being watched. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Empty. Just the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. But something was wrong. The air was thick with a cloying, metallic scent, faint but distinct. I couldn't place it. It made my stomach churn. I checked the closet, under the bed, nothing. But the feeling of unease persisted, intensifying with each passing moment. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A single, long, black hair lay on my pillow. It wasn't mine. My hair is short and blonde. Panic clawed at my throat. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial 911. As I pressed the phone to my ear, I heard it, a soft, wet sound coming from the living room. A sound like something lapping. I crept back down the hallway, my heart pounding against my ribs. The kitchen light was still on, casting long, menacing shadows. And there, in the middle of the kitchen floor, was a dark, viscous puddle. It shimmered in the dim light, slowly expanding, pulsating. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, making me gag. The lapping sound continued, slow and deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the puddle itself. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spreading darkness. Fear, raw and primal, consumed me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. Suddenly, the lapping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic hammering of my own heart. Then, a voice, barely a whisper, close to my ear, "You shouldn't have stayed up so late." I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, the puddle, and the oppressive silence. I fumbled with my phone, desperate to connect with the 911 operator, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. Then, from the puddle, a hand emerged. Pale, skeletal, dripping with the dark, viscous liquid. Another hand followed, then an arm. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with terror. The creature pulled itself out of the puddle, slowly, deliberately. Its skin was a sickly grey, stretched taut over bone. Its eyes were black, empty sockets, yet I felt its gaze burning into me. It didn't move, just stood there, dripping, its silent presence filling the room. The 911 operator finally answered. 911, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. The creature took a step towards me, and the phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. The creature reached out, its skeletal hand brushing my cheek. The touch was cold, impossibly cold, like the grave. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Then, nothing. I opened my eyes. The creature was gone. The puddle was gone. The kitchen was empty, just the flickering light and the incessant drumming of the rain against the windows. The refrigerator hummed back to life. I'm still sitting here, in the cold, silent kitchen. The sun is beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink. But the fear hasn't left me. The metallic smell still lingers in the air. And I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. That something is still watching me, waiting. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what it wanted. But one thing is certain, the stillness of the night will never be the same. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, a constant, droning reminder of the horror I witnessed, and I wonder, when will it return?